I understand you're looking for an extension of your narrative with specific characters and events, and you'd like it written in detail from a male perspective. I'll be sure to create a seamless continuation of the story without adding any new subplots or deviating from your established direction. However, please note that due to the length of the requested text, 25,000 characters, it's best to break it into parts. I'll begin with a detailed continuation in line with your requirements and focus on the investigation into Dr. Ralph Easton and his wife, Eliza, while introducing additional shocking events as per your instructions. The investigation into Winona's death began with a cloud of suspicion hanging over Dr. Ralph Easton. At first, it seemed odd to everyone that a therapist would be caught up in such a grim scenario. But the more the authorities dug, the more they began to uncover a complicated web of relationships and emotions. It started with Dr. Easton's peculiar behavior. In the days following Winona's death, he was strangely detached. His demeanor was calm, even when questioned by detectives, but there was something unsettling in his eyes. The way he looked at the investigators suggested that he knew more than he was letting on, but perhaps didn't feel the urgency to speak it. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't defensive. He simply didn't seem to care. But what stood out the most was his relationship with his wife, Eliza. Eliza Easton was the kind of woman who projected warmth, the kind that made people feel immediately comfortable. On the outside, she had the perfect life, a successful husband, a beautiful home, and the kind of social connections that many would envy. But beneath the surface, Eliza had her own demons, and they were tangled up in the mysterious death of Winona. It turned out that Eliza had known about the therapy sessions between Dr. Easton and Winona. They were not just professional. Over time, their relationship had deepened, emotionally, intellectually, and, it seemed, in ways that could be described as something more than just therapeutic. Though Dr. Easton denied any inappropriate behavior, the things that Winona had said to friends and colleagues hinted at a more personal connection. She often spoke of Dr. Easton as someone who understood her better than anyone else, someone who made her feel seen and heard in ways her previous relationships had failed to do. That kind of intimacy, emotional and intellectual, did not sit well with Eliza. As an accomplished artist in her own right, she was accustomed to a life of prestige, but she had always been plagued by insecurity. Her husband's growing closeness with Winona, a younger woman with a history of trauma and emotional vulnerability, had set off a dangerous jealousy in Eliza. Dr. Easton's refusal to discuss the nature of his relationship with Winona seemed more like a smokescreen than an act of professionalism. His cold detachment from the situation raised questions. Why wasn't he more upset? Why wasn't he more willing to cooperate with the investigation? And what was Eliza hiding? The detectives learned that Eliza had been in the house the night Winona died. The details of that night became murky, but the timeline was crucial. Eliza had been at a dinner party at a mutual friend's house, but her alibi was shaky at best. The party had ended early, and Eliza was seen leaving in a hurry. She claimed to have been home by midnight, but the timing didn't add up. When the police looked closer, they discovered a security camera outside the Easton's property had been tampered with. It was a small, almost imperceptible detail, but it was enough to raise suspicion. Why would Eliza mess with the security cameras? The truth about that night came out in fragments, each one more chilling than the last. It was revealed that on the night of Winona's death, Eliza had confronted Dr. Easton. She had suspected that there was something more to his relationship with Winona than he had let on. They argued for hours, their voices rising in the darkened house. And then, somewhere in the chaos, Eliza did something unforgivable. She found a gun hidden in the study, a gun that had been registered in her name, and she confronted Winona. But that was only part of the story. While Eliza's jealousy drove her to the edge, it wasn't just her animosity toward Winona that led to the tragedy. Dr. Easton's own behavior had pushed her into a corner. He had been more than just a passive participant in the affair with Winona. In fact, it seemed that he had been egging on his wife's jealousy all along. There were private messages between him and Eliza, letters that hinted at manipulative power plays, all designed to keep both women in his control. It was becoming clear, Dr. Easton had been playing both sides, keeping Eliza and Winona close while keeping them both in the dark about the extent of his manipulation. The shocking revelation came when the investigators discovered a hidden journal belonging to Dr. Easton. The journal was filled with detailed entries about his personal life, about Eliza, about his sessions with Winona, and, most revealing of all, about his dark fantasies. It seemed that Dr. Easton had been toying with both women, pushing them to the brink of emotional breakdown, all the while watching from the sidelines as they unraveled. But the journal held one more surprise. It detailed a series of clandestine meetings between Dr. Easton and a woman named Lila. Lila had been another one of his patients, a troubled, charismatic woman who had fallen under his spell just like Winona had. But Lila's story took a darker turn. According to the journal, she had been the one to push Winona to confront Dr. Easton about their relationship. Lila had found out about the affair and had used her influence to set the stage for the confrontation that ultimately led to Winona's death. It was a tangled web, full of lies, manipulation, and obsession. Everyone involved had their hands dirty, but the true extent of their actions was yet to be uncovered. The police eventually put together the full picture of that fateful night. It wasn't just Eliza's jealousy that had led to Winona's death. It was a combination of betrayal, obsession, and manipulation. Dr. Easton had played both women against each other, keeping them in the dark about each other's existence until the very last moment. And as the authorities closed in on the Eastons, there was one final twist. A video surfaced, filmed on the night of Winona's death. It showed Eliza entering the Easton household late at night. She was carrying something in her hand, and as she stepped into the house, the camera cut out. But moments later, a second video surfaced, a grainy recording from a security camera inside the house, capturing the confrontation between Eliza and Winona. It was a brutal scene. Eliza was enraged, her eyes wild with fury as she yelled at Winona. And then, as the argument reached its peak, Eliza lunged at Winona, knocking her to the ground. The struggle was brief, but violent, and when the camera cut out, Winona was left lying motionless on the floor. The rest of the footage revealed Dr. Easton standing in the doorway, watching. He didn't intervene. He didn't stop the fight. He simply watched, almost as if he were waiting for it to happen. The pieces were all in place now. The police had enough to charge Eliza and Dr. Easton with murder, though the question remained, was Dr. Easton the mastermind behind it all, or was he merely an opportunistic bystander, too passive to stop the tragedy from unfolding? The truth was more complex than anyone had imagined. As the investigation continued, it became clear that this was not just a case of jealousy and rage. It was a carefully orchestrated plan, a long-running series of manipulations that had led to a woman's death. Dr. Easton, for all his calm exterior, had been the puppet master. He had played with both women's emotions, twisting them until they had snapped. The investigation took an unexpected turn when authorities discovered a series of correspondences between Winona and Eliza. These weren't just casual letters or friendly exchanges, they were hostile, filled with animosity and thinly veiled threats. In her messages, Eliza warned Winona to stay away from Ralph, her husband, urging her to sever all ties with him. At first, it seemed like typical jealousy from a wife who had suspected an affair. But as the detectives dug deeper into these messages, a darker truth started to emerge. Eliza's tone was colder than it first appeared. She wasn't just warning Winona for her own sake, she seemed to be sending a message, almost as if she knew something that Winona didn't. Eliza's fear and rage at the thought of her husband's attachment to another woman were clear, but there was something else too, something more ominous in her words. She made it clear that any further involvement between the two would have consequences. It wasn't just about love or betrayal anymore. There was a palpable sense of danger in her warnings. The messages spoke of betrayal, of secrets Eliza had uncovered about Ralph and Winona. The more the detectives read through these letters, the more it seemed like Eliza wasn't just a woman scorned, she was someone desperate to keep control, to prevent something darker from coming to light. And her warnings weren't just to protect her marriage, they seemed to be a warning to Winona about something far worse. But the correspondence also raised another question. Why hadn't Winona taken Eliza's threats seriously? Why had she continued to see Ralph despite the warning? Was it possible that Winona didn't fully understand the danger she was in, or had she become so entangled in the manipulation of Ralph Easton that she couldn't see the truth? Then came the breakthrough. The police found something entirely unexpected, another layer to the story that nobody had anticipated. A series of disturbing, almost obsessive notes, letters, and text messages exchanged between Winona and Ralph's 17-year-old nephew, Kyle. Kyle Easton was an enigma. On the surface, he was a seemingly quiet teenager, an honor student who stayed out of trouble and was rarely seen around the public eye. But beneath that mask, a different picture began to form. Kyle had been infatuated with Winona, obsessively so. The authorities found old photographs, pieces of artwork he'd created of her, and disturbing messages that suggested he viewed her as some kind of unattainable goddess, someone he believed was meant to be with him, not with his Uncle Ralph. As the investigation unraveled, it became clear that Kyle's obsession with Winona had crossed into dangerous territory. There were even mentions of him spying on her during her sessions with Dr. Easton. Kyle had taken it upon himself to watch from a distance, following her movements, tracking her down to places she frequented. At first, it seemed like harmless infatuation, the kind of thing a teenager might grow out of. But the more they read, the more it became clear that Kyle wasn't just interested in Winona. He was jealous, consumed with a need to possess her, to make her his, no matter the cost. The police found a collection of diary entries in which Kyle described how he had watched his uncle and Winona interact, with increasingly disturbing commentary on their relationship. He was jealous of his uncle's influence over her, angry at how she seemed to be getting closer to Dr. Easton. In his mind, Winona wasn't just a woman caught in a love triangle. She was his, and anyone who stood in the way was a threat. As detectives dug deeper into Kyle's background, they discovered his history of troubling behavior. He had a record of emotional outbursts and an unhealthy attachment to his uncle. Kyle had been living with Ralph and Eliza for the past few years after his parents had died in a car accident, and it was clear that the relationship between him and his uncle had been anything but normal. Ralph had always been a steady, calming influence in Kyle's life, but there was something off about their bond, something that made those closest to them uneasy. Ralph had always been protective of Kyle, perhaps too protective, and his nephew had developed a strange loyalty to him, one that seemed to bleed into his feelings for Winona. There were rumors that Ralph had allowed Kyle to be involved in the therapy sessions, giving him an opportunity to get close to Winona. Kyle had attended sessions with his uncle on more than one occasion, but nobody could say for certain whether he was aware of the growing tension between them or if he had somehow been encouraged to develop his own attachment to her. The turning point came when the detectives unearthed a hidden video on one of Ralph's old computers, a video that made it all too clear just how deep Kyle's obsession had gone. The footage was grainy, taken from a camera in the backyard of the Easton estate, but it was chilling nonetheless. It showed Kyle, in the dead of night, sneaking around the house. He was holding a camera, recording through a window, watching as Winona and Ralph spoke to each other in the living room. There was something about the way Kyle stared at her through the lens, a twisted longing in his eyes that made it clear his feelings weren't just innocent admiration. Kyle had been tracking Winona's every move. He'd been watching her for months, following her wherever she went, recording her conversations with his uncle, and growing more resentful of the connection they had. The footage also revealed something even more disturbing. In one of the recordings, Kyle was caught muttering to himself, whispering about how she was meant to be mine. It was chilling, the way he spoke, almost like he was trying to convince himself that his feelings were justified, that his desire to control her was normal. But what really struck the investigators was a message that Kyle had left for Winona, hidden among his drawings of her. In it, he confessed his love for her, but it wasn't a simple love letter. It was a declaration of ownership. He wrote about how he had been waiting for her to realize that Ralph was just a stepping stone, that she was meant to be with him. He even mentioned that he would do whatever it took to make sure she was his, no matter what that entailed. The investigators began to piece it together. Kyle wasn't just an innocent teenager with a crush. He had been slowly spiraling into dangerous obsession. His anger, jealousy, and desire for control had built up over time. He resented the way Ralph had taken an interest in Winona and how his uncle had effectively shut him out of their personal world. Kyle believed that he was the one who deserved Winona's affection, not Ralph. As the investigators examined Kyle's interactions with Winona, they learned that there had been a number of incidents where he had tried to confront her. He had sent her gifts, flowers, poems, and on one occasion, had even shown up at her apartment uninvited, demanding that she pay attention to him. Each time, she had rebuffed him, growing more uncomfortable with his advances. It was clear that Kyle had been pushed to the edge, unable to handle rejection. But there was still a question that hung in the air. Did Kyle kill Winona? Did he act alone, or was his uncle, Ralph, complicit in some way? The authorities weren't ready to make any definitive conclusions, but the evidence against Kyle was mounting. The pieces were falling into place, showing that Kyle had been driven by a dangerous mixture of jealousy, obsession, and a deep-rooted resentment toward both his uncle and Winona. The question now was whether his actions had been impulsive, or if they were part of a larger, more calculated plan. A plan that involved more than just Kyle's feelings for Winona, but also his desire to destroy what he saw as an obstacle in his path to the life he believed he deserved. The deeper the investigation went, the more twisted the situation became. The revelation that Kyle Easton had developed a violent jealousy toward Winona, sparked by her relationship with his uncle, Ralph, was unsettling, to say the least. At first, Kyle had hidden his feelings, buried them beneath a quiet, almost docile exterior. But as the days passed and the truth about the relationship between Ralph and Winona came out, Kyle's behavior took a darker, more dangerous turn. It was as if a switch had been flipped in him. The subtle obsession he had harbored for months began to escalate into something far more aggressive. His stalking of Winona grew bolder, more intrusive. He would show up uninvited at places where she frequented, at the gym, at coffee shops, even near her apartment. It wasn't overtly threatening at first, but it was impossible to ignore the way Kyle's presence lingered, how his eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went. It was as though he thought he had some kind of ownership over her, and when she didn't respond, when she kept rejecting his advances, his frustration turned into rage. Kyle's behavior was erratic, even terrifying. He would approach her with a forced calmness, acting as if he were merely trying to talk. But the things he said, the way he spoke about his uncle Ralph and Winona's place in his life, made her uncomfortable. His words carried an edge of entitlement, as though he believed that by sheer force of will, he could make her see things his way. And whenever she pushed him away, his anger boiled just beneath the surface, simmering with a level of aggression that made her fear for her safety. But the real shock came when the police learned of a far more devastating secret. Winona was pregnant. The news hit like a thunderclap. It was an undeniable truth that shifted everything in the investigation. For weeks, Winona had been seeing Ralph under the guise of therapy sessions, but now it was clear that their relationship had gone far beyond professional boundaries. She was carrying Ralph's child, and this fact shook the entire foundation of the case. No one had expected this. It wasn't just a simple affair anymore. It was a tangled mess of lies, deceit, and a pregnancy that threatened to unravel everything. When I first learned of it, it made sense in a way I hadn't anticipated. The timeline matched up with some of the troubling events we had uncovered. But it wasn't just about the pregnancy. It was about what came next, what it meant for Ralph, for Kyle, and for everyone involved. For Ralph, this pregnancy was a nightmare. As a respected therapist with a picture-perfect reputation, the idea of having a child with a woman who wasn't his wife would be catastrophic. The scandal would ruin him, not just professionally, but personally. And if it came out that he had been carrying on an affair with a vulnerable patient, one who had been in therapy under his care, there would be legal consequences far more serious than just the breakdown of his marriage. This revelation threw Ralph into a panic. He had always been controlling, always calculating, but this was beyond anything he had expected. The thought of a child, a permanent reminder of his infidelity, was unbearable. He had to act fast to prevent everything from falling apart. The detectives learned from people close to Ralph that his behavior had shifted in the days after they discovered the pregnancy. He had become more erratic, more anxious, always checking his phone, always looking over his shoulder. He was trying to cover his tracks, to figure out how to avoid the inevitable fallout. The pregnancy wasn't just a scandal waiting to happen, it was a ticking time bomb. If anyone found out about it, Ralph would lose everything. But Ralph wasn't the only one who had a stake in this secret. Kyle had his own twisted reaction to the news, one that was born of his obsessive, possessive feelings toward Winona. The fact that she was carrying his uncle's child sent Kyle into a spiral of fury and jealousy. For him, it was the final straw. He had already felt overshadowed by his uncle in every way, but now this was a betrayal he couldn't forgive. Kyle had spent months obsessing over Winona, trying to make her see that she belonged with him, only to realize that she had chosen his uncle, the man he so desperately wanted to dethrone in his life. The pregnancy confirmed it for him. Winona wasn't just a woman he desired, she was lost to him forever, bound to Ralph in a way that could never be undone. Kyle's obsession with her turned to bitterness, then to rage. He wasn't just jealous of Ralph, he was furious at everyone who stood between him and what he believed was rightfully his. He began to lash out more openly, showing up at her apartment more often, leaving threatening notes, sending even more disturbing messages. At one point, a neighbor reported seeing him lingering outside Winona's window late at night, staring into her apartment as though he thought he could will her to look at him. The pregnancy changed the dynamics between Ralph and Kyle, too. Ralph had always kept Kyle at arm's length, but now, with the revelation of the baby, their relationship became even more strained. Kyle began to grow resentful of Ralph's calm, collected demeanor, of the way he handled the situation with such control. Kyle, on the other hand, was losing his grip. His jealousy turned into something darker, more dangerous. He no longer saw himself as simply an innocent bystander in this chaotic love triangle. He began to see himself as the rightful heir to Winona's affections, and the unborn child that she carried was a symbol of everything he had lost. The tension between them grew to a breaking point, especially after Ralph's failed attempts to control the narrative. He tried to convince Winona to terminate the pregnancy, to disappear from their lives completely. His fear of the consequences, legal, social, personal, was palpable. He told her that no one would understand, that they couldn't afford for anyone to find out. But Winona wasn't so easily swayed. She wasn't the kind of woman who could be manipulated by guilt or fear. Not anymore. She wasn't going to be coerced into making a decision that didn't feel right to her, regardless of what Ralph or anyone else wanted. The more Ralph pressed her, the more desperate he became. And with Kyle's anger growing, fueled by his unhealthy obsession with Winona, the situation was becoming explosive. There was only so much tension the Easton family could bear before everything erupted. But the most terrifying part was how quickly things were spiraling out of control. Kyle's actions were becoming more dangerous. His obsession was no longer confined to just watching and stalking. He began to talk openly about taking care of things, about doing whatever was necessary to fix the situation, to make it right in his eyes. By the time the detectives pieced it all together, they realized just how intertwined all these emotions had become. The pregnancy, the jealousy, the manipulation, it was a powder keg waiting to blow. And in the middle of it all, Kyle, the teenager, was becoming the most dangerous player in this twisted game. It was a cold, overcast day when it all went wrong. From the moment Ralph had walked into the house, I could feel the tension building. There had been a sense of inevitability to it all. The pregnancy, the lies, the jealousy, it had all been leading up to this moment. The fragile web of secrets and manipulation was about to snap, and when it did, there would be no going back. Winona had resisted Ralph's attempts to get her to terminate the pregnancy for weeks. She wasn't ready to end it, no matter how much Ralph pushed her. She had always been strong-willed, always defiant in the face of manipulation. But I think even she had no idea just how far Ralph would go to force her hand. He had been frantic in the days leading up to that afternoon. There were phone calls, there were tense meetings with lawyers, even a few threats that I only learned about later. Ralph was terrified not just of the scandal, but of the legal consequences. If anyone found out that he had been having an affair with one of his patients and had gotten her pregnant, well, his career, his entire life, would be over. But more than that, I think Ralph was afraid of losing control. He had always prided himself on being the one in charge, whether it was in his therapy sessions, in his marriage, or in his relationship with Kyle. To have a woman, especially someone like Winona, turn against him, reject him, and take something as significant as a child from him, that was more than he could tolerate. That afternoon, when Ralph arrived at Winona's apartment, I knew something bad was going to happen. I wasn't there at the time, but the details of what transpired would soon come to light. Ralph tried to talk to her, but his words were sharp, calculated. He didn't care about the baby, not really. All he cared about was saving himself from the fallout. He told her she had to end it, that they both knew it was the only option. Winona, as always, stood her ground. She told him no. She told him she would keep the baby. She wasn't going to let him control her anymore. And that's when Ralph lost it. In the heat of the moment, his calm facade cracked. He raised his voice, something he hadn't done before. His words were no longer persuasive, they were demands. He told her she didn't understand what was at stake, that she was ruining everything. He grabbed her arm, maybe a little too roughly, and shoved her back against the wall. The moment was a flash, everything happened so fast. The anger in Ralph's eyes was unmistakable. There was a wildness to him that I hadn't seen before, and I think even he realized, in that moment, that he had gone too far. He pushed her again, this time harder, and when she stumbled back, she hit her head on the edge of the coffee table. Winona fell to the ground, dazed but still conscious. She wasn't unconscious, but she wasn't able to get up. Ralph stood over her, breathing heavily, his face flushed with fury and panic. It wasn't just the pregnancy now, it was everything. His own fear of being exposed, of losing his carefully constructed life, had overtaken him. In a frantic attempt to control the situation, Ralph tried to calm her, tried to help her back up, but it was too late. I don't know if it was intentional or if he just lost all sense of himself, but the way he grabbed her then, he was pushing her harder than he realized. She fell backward again, this time hitting her head against the floor. This time, she didn't move. At that point, Ralph knew something terrible had happened. He knelt next to her, shaking her, trying to get a response, but it was clear she was gone. There was no sound, no movement. She was still. The baby, gone. Ralph stood up, his mind racing. He was in shock, but his first instinct wasn't to call for help. It wasn't to admit what had just happened. It was to cover his tracks. I can only imagine what was going through his head. He was too calm for someone who had just taken a life. His hands were shaking as he wiped them down his pants. He knew the only way out was to make it look like an accident. Ralph spent the next few minutes staging the scene. He moved her body, repositioned her arms, and tried to make it seem like she had tripped and fallen, that the blow to the head was just a terrible accident. He placed an empty wine glass near her hand, making it appear as if she had been drinking alone when the fall occurred. But despite his efforts to stage it, the evidence wasn't on his side. The first responders' report didn't match the story. The position of her body didn't make sense for a simple fall. A closer look at the scene revealed signs of a struggle, scratches on the walls, the marks on her arms where Ralph had grabbed her. Even the neighbors had heard the raised voices, and there were witnesses who had seen Ralph leaving her apartment shortly before the authorities arrived. The detectives quickly pieced it together. There was no accident. It was murder. The evidence was damning. Ralph tried to deny it all when they questioned him, but the pressure mounted. His calmness turned to frustration. The lies he had told, the calm demeanor he had tried to maintain, crumbled under the weight of the truth. The phone records, the security footage, the witnesses who had seen him storm out of the building in a panic, all of it led to one conclusion: Ralph had killed Winona. The pregnancy, the pressure, his fear of the consequences, it had all pushed him to make a deadly choice. By the time the police arrested him, it was all too clear. He was caught in his own web of lies, and there was no way out. As the investigators combed through the evidence, they found the final, damning piece of the puzzle. Ralph had tried to clean up the scene, to erase the traces of violence. He had even gone so far as to delete certain texts, messages between him and Winona, but they were still there. In the end, the truth was impossible to hide. Ralph was arrested for the murder of Winona. The child she carried, his child, was gone too. He had destroyed everything. His marriage, his career, and now his freedom. But nothing mattered to him anymore, not in the way it had before. The control he had so carefully cultivated over the years had slipped through his fingers, and now, All that remained was the bitter reality of what he had done. I never could have predicted how far Ralph would go to protect himself, to keep everything under his control. But in the end, his desperation led him down a dark, irreversible path. The truth was out now, and there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom buzzed with a tension that was almost palpable, the air thick with anticipation and judgment. People filled the seats, their eyes fixed on Ralph Easton as he sat at the defense table, flanked by his lawyer. The once respected therapist, the calm and composed man who had controlled so many lives, now looked small and helpless in the face of the charges. The prosecution laid out the case with chilling clarity. They had the evidence, the witnesses, the medical reports. They had everything they needed to prove that Ralph had killed Winona in a fit of rage after she refused to terminate the pregnancy. But just when it seemed like there was no hope left for him, something unexpected happened. Elisa, Ralph's wife, took the stand. I don't think anyone was prepared for what came next. Elisa Easton, who had spent weeks in the background, appearing to be a victim of her husband's deceit, suddenly claimed that she had killed Winona. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her words were clear. It was me. I killed her. Ralph had nothing to do with it. He didn't even touch her. I lost control. I was jealous and I couldn't handle it. I'm the one who pushed her. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. It was as if time had stopped. I could see Ralph's face, the shock, the disbelief, as his wife took the blame for the murder. The judge looked down at her in stunned confusion, while the jurors exchanged uneasy glances. The entire prosecution team sat frozen for a moment, trying to process what they had just heard. At first, Elisa's claim seemed like a desperate attempt to shield her husband. There was no evidence, no witness testimony, that suggested she had been involved in the murder. All the evidence pointed directly to Ralph. Her statement was too convenient, too rehearsed, and the timing of it could not have been more suspicious. Her claim came after Ralph had been shown to be the one who had been with Winona in her final moments. The photos, the messages, the security footage, all of it painted a clear picture of Ralph's guilt. Elisa's statement wasn't an act of redemption or truth, it was a desperate plea to protect the man she had spent years with. She had seen the walls closing in on him, and in a frantic bid to save him from the consequences of his actions, she made the claim. She thought that by confessing to the crime, she would be able to deflect attention from Ralph, to keep him out of prison, or at least lessen his sentence. But it didn't work. The prosecution wasted no time tearing her statement apart. They showed how Elisa's claim was filled with inconsistencies, how it contradicted the physical evidence. Experts testified that there was no way Elisa could have been the one to inflict the fatal blow. The injuries to Winona's head were consistent with Ralph's size and strength, not Elisa's. It was clear to everyone that her testimony was a lie, a last-ditch attempt to save a man who didn't deserve it. Ralph's defense team tried to use her statement to their advantage, arguing that Elisa's false confession proved their client's innocence. They painted her as a woman deeply disturbed by her husband's affair, someone who had been pushed to the brink by jealousy and frustration. They suggested that Elisa's emotional state had caused her to act irrationally, to take responsibility for something she hadn't done. But no matter how hard they tried, the truth was undeniable. Ralph was the one who had killed Winona, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. In the end, Ralph Easton was convicted of second-degree murder. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days before returning a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison, a sentence that was met with both relief and disbelief by the people in the courtroom. For some, justice had been served. For others, it was a harsh reminder of the damage caused by a man who had used his position to manipulate and control the lives of others. As the gavel fell, I could see the devastation in Ralph's eyes. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of his power, was now reduced to a prisoner of his own actions. His carefully crafted life had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but the cold reality of his guilt. I couldn't help but wonder if he had ever truly believed that he would get away with it, if he had ever thought he was above the law. After the trial, Ralph was taken away in handcuffs, a broken man. His reputation, his career, his family, all of it was gone. Prison wasn't a place where Ralph would be treated with the same reverence he once commanded. He quickly became an outcast. He was no longer the respected therapist, the pillar of his community. In prison, he was just another murderer, a man whose crimes had left a trail of destruction behind him. His name had been tarnished beyond repair, and even in the harsh world of prison, he would be a marked man. I saw a few reports of what happened to him in prison. They weren't pretty. He was often isolated, targeted by other inmates who saw him as a symbol of everything they despised. His arrogance, his calculated demeanor, these qualities that had once made him so powerful, now made him a target. There were even whispers of violent altercations, of beatings he had received. Prison has a way of stripping a man of his illusions, of breaking him down until nothing is left but the raw truth of who he is. But while Ralph's life in prison became a nightmare, Elisa's fate was no less tragic, though in a different way. She had spent years living in the shadow of her husband's manipulations, believing that she was doing what was best for their marriage, for her family. She had convinced herself that her loyalty to Ralph was more important than anything else. But when the truth came out, when she saw her husband convicted of murder, she was shattered. Elisa tried to hold it together, to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the emotional toll was unbearable. She had spent years lying to herself, to the world, about the man she had married. She had known about his affair, had known about the way he controlled and manipulated others. But she had never imagined it would come to this. She had never imagined that Ralph would kill someone, that his obsession with keeping his life intact would drive him to murder. In the months that followed the trial, Elisa became a shadow of the woman she had once been. She couldn't go to the places she used to frequent, couldn't face the people who had once respected her. She was no longer the charming, sophisticated woman who had stood by Ralph's side. She was a woman marked by betrayal and loss. The life she had built was gone, and in its place was only a gaping hole of grief and regret. Elisa visited Ralph in prison once, maybe twice. I'm not sure what she expected from him, or if she thought there was anything left to salvage. But each time, she left more broken than before. The man she had married was gone, replaced by a cold, bitter shell of a man who had lost everything. And so, she lived in the aftermath of it all, haunted by the knowledge that her blind loyalty had cost her everything. She had lost her husband to the prison system, and in a way, she had lost herself as well. The woman who had once been so sure of her place in the world now found herself adrift, alone with nothing but the weight of the lies and the violence that had defined her life. Both of them, Ralph and Elisa, had been consumed by their own desires, their own need for control. And in the end, both of them were left with nothing.